So today I'm going to read out aloud The Psychology of Money, this book right here. So I've not read it. I only read the introduction and a bit of chapter 1 and thought to myself, okay, why don't I read it online? Because I think that I'm going to start a book club and this is a place to start. So, The Psychology of Money, written by Morgan Housel. Here it is. So let us start. Let us start. The Psychology of Money. Timeless lessons on wealth, greed, and happiness. So there's two quotes here. Let me read them. He's quoted them on this page. A genius is the man who can do the average thing when everyone else around him is losing his mind. Written by Napoleon. The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. Quote written by Sherlock Holmes. Oh, I see there's somebody in the live. Hello, how are you? I would like to know if my voice is clear. Can you hear me clearly? Okay. There's a message, I suppose. Okay, let me start. Introduction. The greatest show on earth. So we are starting. I spent my college years working as a valet at a nice hotel in LA. One frequent guest was a technology executive. He was a genius, having designed and patented a key component in Wi-Fi routers in his 20s. He had started and sold several companies. He was widely successful. Thank you, Safari. He also had a relationship with money I describe as a mix of insecurity and childish stupidity. He carried a stack of $100 bills several inches thick. He showed it to everyone who wanted to see it and many who didn't. He bragged openly and loudly about his wealth, often while drunk and always apropos of nothing. One day, he handed one of my colleagues several $1,000s of cash and said, go to the jewelry store down the street and get me a few thousand gold coins. An hour later, gold coins in hand, the tech executive and his buddies gathered around by a dock overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Then they proceeded to throw the coins into the sea, skipping them like rocks, cackling as they argued whose went farthest, just for fun. Days later, he shattered a lamp in the hotel's restaurant. A manager told him it was a $500 lamp and he'd have to replace it. You want $500? The executive asked incredulously, while pulling a brick of cash from his pocket and handing it to the manager. Here's $5,000. Now get out of my face. And don't ever insult me like that again. You may wonder how long this behavior could last. And the answer was, not long. I learned years later that he went broke. The premise of this book is that doing well with money has little to do with how smart you are and a lot to do with how you behave. And behavior is hard to teach, even to really smart people. A genius who loses control of their emotions can be a financial disaster. The opposite is also true. Ordinary folks with no financial education can be wealthy if they have a handful of behavioral skills that have nothing to do with formal measures of intelligence. My favorite Wikipedia entry begins. Ronald James Reed was an American philanthropist, investor, janitor, and gas station attendant. Ronald Reed was born in rural Vermont. He was the first person in his family to graduate high school, made all the more impressive by the fact that he hitchhiked to campus every day. For those who knew Ronald Read, there wasn't much else worth mentioning. His life was about as low-key as they come. So this is a story about someone he's telling. It's one of the examples. He's giving examples about how behaviors on how you behave with money, how it might. He's proving the point that what matters is how you behave with money. Okay, so this Ronald Read fixed cars at a gas station for 25 years and swept floors at Penny for 17 years. He bought a 2-bedroom house for $12,000 at the age of 38 and lived there for the rest of his life. He was widowed at the age of 50 and never remarried. A friend recalled that his main hobby was chopping firewood, so this was a regular man. Read died in 2014 at age 92, which was when the humble rural janitor made international headlines. Okay, so about 3 million Americans died in 2014. Fewer than 4,000 of them had a net worth of over 8 million when they passed away. Ronald Read was one of them, and he was a janitor his entire life, yet he died a millionaire. In his will, the former janitor left $2 million to his stepkids and more than $6 million to his local hospital and library. Those who knew Read were baffled. Where did he get all that money? It turned out that there was no secret. There was no lottery win and no inheritance. Read saved what little he could and invested it in blue chip stocks. Then he waited for decades on end as tiny savings compounded into more than $8 million. That's it, from janitor to philanthropist. A few months before Ronald Read died, another man named Richard was in the news. Richard was everything Ronald was not. A Harvard-educated executive with an MBA. Richard had such a successful career in finance that he retired in his 40s to become a philanthropist. Former CEO David he was his boss, praised this Richard that he was business savvy, leadership skills, sound judgment, and personal integrity. Crane's Business magazine once included him in a 40 under 40 list of successful business people. Now we're talking about a different person. Now this is not the janitor. Now this is another person who was incredibly successful in his life and incredibly wealthy. This Richard. But then, like the gold coins keeping tech executive, everything fell apart. In the mid-2000s, Richard borrowed heavily to expand an 18,000 square foot home in Greenwich, which had 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 pools, 7 garages, and cost more than $90,000 a month to maintain. Then in 2008, financial crisis hit. The crisis hurt virtually everyone's finances. It apparently turned Richard into dust. High debt, illiquid assets left him bankrupt. I currently have no income, he allegedly told a bankruptcy judge in 2008. We're talking about a person who was considered wealthy and highly successful. He was even in the 40 under 40 list of successful people, yet here he is saying he has nothing. Okay. So first, his beach house was closed. In 2014, it was the Greenwich Mansion's turn. This mansion that he took debt to expand. 5 months before Ronald Read, the janitor, left his fortune to charity, Richard's home, where guests recalled, they used to call Richard's home the thrill of dining and dancing, atop a see-through covering on the home's indoor swimming pool, was sold in a foreclosure auction for 75% less than an insurance company figured it was worth. What a waste. So What is the difference between these two people? Ronald Read was patient. Richard was greedy. That's all it took to eclipse the massive education and experience gap between the two. Because Richard was a person with he went to an Ivy League school and he was successful, had a great job and experience. Yet the janitor died being more wealthy than Richard. Okay, the lesson here is not to be more like Ronald and less like Richard, though it's not bad advice. The fascinating thing about these two stories is how unique they are to finance. In what other industry does someone with no college degree, no training, no background, no formal experience, and no connections massively outperform someone with the best education, the best training, and the best connections? I struggle to think of any. It is impossible to think of a story about Ronald performing a heart transplant better than a Harvard-trained surgeon, or designing a skyscraper superior to the best-trained architects. There will never be a story of a janitor outperforming the world's top nuclear engineers. Yes, that is true. But these stories do happen in investing. So the author is saying the only field that somebody who has no education, no skills can outperform one of the people who have like Ivy League education, like the creme de la creme, is finance. The fact that Ronald can coexist with Richard has two explanations. One, financial outcomes are driven by luck, independent of intelligence and effort. That's true to some extent, and this book will discuss it in further detail. Or two, and I think more common, that financial success is not a hard science. It is a soft skill where how you behave is more important than what you know. I call this soft skill the psychology of money. The aim of this book is to use short stories to convince you that soft skills are more important than the technical side of money. I'll do this in a way that will help everyone from Reed to Richard and everyone in between make good financial decisions. These soft skills are, I've come to realize, greatly underappreciated. Finance is overwhelmingly taught as a math-based field where you put data into a formula and formula tells you what to do, and it's assumed that you'll just go do it. This is true in personal finance where you are told to have a 6-month emergency fund and save 10% of your salary. It's true in investing where we know the exact historical correlations between interest rates and valuations. And it's true in corporate finance where CFOs can measure the precise cost of capital. It's not that any of these things are bad or wrong. It's that knowing what to do tells you nothing about what happens in your head when you try to do it. But it's true because everybody knows that you're supposed to save and invest. So why don't more people do it? Why don't we do it religiously? Why? Two topics impact everyone, whether you are interested in them or not. These two topics are health and money. The healthcare industry is a triumph of modern science, with rising life expectancy across the world. Scientific discoveries have replaced doctors' old ideas about how the human body works, and virtually everyone is healthier because of it. The money that is investing, personal finance, business planning, is another story. Finance has scooped up the smartest minds coming from top universities over the last 2 decades. Financial Financial engineering was the most popular major in Princeton School of Engineering a decade ago. Is there any evidence that it has made us better investors? I have seen none. Through collective trial and error over the years, we learned how to become better farmers, skilled plumbers, and advanced chemists. But has trial and error taught us to become better with our finances? Are we less likely to bury ourselves in debt, more likely to save for a rainy day, prepare for retirement, have realistic views about what money does and doesn't do to our happiness? I've seen no compelling evidence. Most of the reason why I believe is that we think about and are taught about money in ways that are too much like physics, with rules and laws, and not enough like psychology, with emotions and nuance. And that to me is as fascinating as it is important. Money is everywhere. It affects all of us and confuses most of us. Everyone thinks about it a little differently. It offers lessons on things that apply to many areas of life, like risk, confidence, and happiness. Few topics offer a more powerful magnifying glass that helps explain why people behave the way they do than with money. It is one of the greatest shows on earth. My own appreciation for psychology of money is shaped by more than a decade of writing on this topic. I began writing about finance in early 2008. It was the dawn of a financial crisis and the worst recession in 80 years. To write about what was happening, I wanted to figure out what was happening. But the first thing I learned about the financial crisis was that no one could accurately explain what happened or why it happened, let alone what should be done about it. For every good explanation, there was an equally convincing rebuttal. Engineers can determine the cause of a bridge collapse because there's agreement that if a certain amount of force is applied to a certain area, that area will break. Physics is not controversial, it is guided by laws. Finance is different, it is guided by people's behaviors, and how I behave might make sense to me but look crazy to you. The more I studied and wrote about the financial crisis, the more I realized that you could understand it better through the lenses of psychology and history, not finance. To grasp why people bury themselves in debt, you don't need to study interest rates. You need to study the history of greed, insecurity, and optimism. To get why investors sell out at the bottom of a bear market, you don't need to study the math of expected future returns. You need to think about the agony of looking at your family and wondering if your investments are imperiling their future. I love Voltaire's observation that history never repeats itself, man always does. It applies so well to how we behave with money. In 2018, I wrote a report outlining 20 of the most important flaws, biases, and causes of bad behavior I have seen affect people when dealing with money. It was called The Psychology of Money, and over 1 million people have read it. This book is a deeper dive into the topic. Some short passages from the report appear unaltered in this book. What you are holding is 20 chapters, each describing what I consider to be the most important and often counterintuitive features of psychology and money. The chapters revolve around a common theme, but exist on their own and can be read independently. It's not a long book, you're welcome. Most readers don't finish the books that they begin because most single topics do not require 300 pages of explanation. I'd rather make 20 short short points you finish than one long one you give up on. So there we go. That was the introduction. Let's go to chapter 1 of the psychology of money. So I'm only going to read chapter 1. Yeah, hopefully it's not that long. So, chapter 1, no one is crazy. Your personal experiences with money make up maybe 0.0000001% of what's happened in the world, but maybe 80% of how you think the world works. Let me tell you about a problem. It might make you feel better about what you do with your money and less judgmental about what other people do with theirs. People do some crazy things with money, but no one is crazy. Here's the thing. People from different generations, raised by different parents who earned different incomes and held different values in different parts of the world, born into different economies, experiencing different job markets with different incentives and different degrees of luck, learn very different lessons. Everyone has their own unique experience with how the world works. And in what you've experienced, is more compelling than what you learn secondhand. So all of us, you, me, everyone, go through life anchored to a set of views about how money works, and that vary wildly from person to person. What seems crazy to you might make sense to me. The person who grew up in poverty thinks about risk and reward in ways the child of a wealthy banker cannot fathom, even when he tried. The person who grew up when inflation was high experienced something the person who grew up with stable prices never had to do. The stockbroker who lost everything during the Great Depression experienced something the tech worker basking in the glory of the late 1990s cannot imagine. The Australia who has not seen a recession in 30 years has experienced something no American ever has. On and on, the list of experiences is endless. You know stuff about money that I don't, and vice versa. You go through life with different beliefs, goals, and forecasts than I do. That's not because one of us is smarter than the other or one has better information. It is because we've had different lives shaped by different and equally persuasive experiences. Okay. Your personal experiences with money make up maybe 0.0000001% of what's happened in the world, but maybe 80% of how you think the world works. So, equally smart people can disagree about how and why recessions happen, how you should invest your money, what you should prioritize, how much risk you should take on, and so on. In his book on 1930s America, Frederick Lewis Allen wrote that the Great Depression marked millions of Americans inwardly for the rest of their lives. But there was a range of experiences. 25 years later, as he was running for president, John F. Kennedy was asked by a reporter what he remembered from the Depression. He remarked, I have no first-hand knowledge of the Depression. My family had one of the great fortunes of the world, and it was worth more than ever then. We had bigger houses, more servants. We traveled more. About the only thing that I saw directly was when my father hired some extra gardeners just to give them a job so they could eat. I really did not learn about the Depression until I read about it at Harvard. Isn't that crazy? Like some people are experiencing the greatest depression ever, the worst economic experience ever. Others didn't even feel the pain. Them, they are thriving. Wow, okay. This was a major point in the 1960 election. How people thought could someone with no understanding of the biggest economic story of the last generation be put in charge of the economy? It was in many ways overcome only by JFK's experience in World War II. That was the other most widespread emotional experience of the previous generation, and something his primary opponent, Hubert Humphrey, didn't have. The challenge for us is that no amount of studying or open-mindedness can genuinely recreate the power of fear and uncertainty. I can read about what it was like to lose everything during the Great Depression, but I don't have the emotional scars of those who actually experienced it. And the person who lived through it can't fathom why someone like me could come across as complacent about things like owning stocks. We see the world through a different lens. Spreadsheets can model the historic frequency of big stock market deadlines, but they can't model the feeling of coming home, looking at your kids and wondering if you've made a mistake that will impact their lives. Studying history makes you feel like you understand something, but until you've lived through it and personally felt its consequences, you may not understand it enough to change your behavior. We all think we know how the world works, but we've only experienced a tiny sliver of it. As investor Michael Batnick says, some lessons have to be experienced before they can be understood. We are all victims in different ways to that truth. In 2006, economist Malmengia and Stefan Nagel from the National Bureau of Economic Research dug through 50 years of survey of custom. Sorry. So in 2006, these economists dug through 50 years of the survey of consumer finances, a detailed look at what Americans do with their money. In theory, people should make investment decisions based on their goals and the characteristic of investment options available to them at the time. But that's not what people do. The economists found that people's lifetime investment decisions are heavily anchored to the experiences those investors had in their own generation, especially experiences early in their adult life. If you grew up when inflation was high, you invested less of your money in bonds later in life compared to those who grew up when inflation was low. If you happened to grow up when the stock market was strong, you invested more of your money in stocks later in life compared to those who grew up when stocks were weak. The economists wrote, "Our findings suggest that individual investors' willingness to bear risk depends on personal history, not intelligence or education or sophistication, just the damn luck of when and where you were born." Eish. The Financial Times interviewed Bill Gross, the famed bond manager, in 2019. Gross admits that he would probably not be where he is today if he had been born a decade earlier or later. The piece said Gross' career coincided almost perfectly with a generational collapse in interest rates that gave bond prices a tailwind. That kind of thing doesn't just affect the opportunities you come across. It affects what you think about those opportunities when they are presented to you. To Gross, bonds were wealth-generating machines. To his father's generation, who grew up who grew up with and endured higher inflation, they might be seen as wealth incinerators. The difference in how people have experienced money are not small, even among those you might think are pretty similar. Take stocks. If you were born in 1970, the S&P 500 increased almost tenfold, adjusted for inflation during your teens and 20s. That is an amazing return. If you were born in 1950, the market went literally nowhere in your teens and 20s, adjusted for inflation. Two groups of people separated by chance of their birth year go through life with a completely different view on how the stock market works. Okay. So here's a graph. He's trying to demonstrate the point. He's saying that people make financial decisions literally just based on the generation you were born in, which year you were born in, and the experiences that you had in your early adult life. Okay. Two groups of people separated by chance of their birth year go through life with completely different view on how the stock market works or inflation. If you're born around in 1960s America, inflation during your teens and 20s, your young impressionable years when you're developing a base of knowledge about how the economy works, sent prices up more than threefold. That's a lot. You remember gas lines and getting paychecks that stretched noticeably less far than the ones before them. But if you're born in the 1990s, inflation has been so low for your whole life that it's probably never even crossed your mind. Okay. Right, so let me explain this graph. So this graph, it's about people born between 1950 and 1970. So these are the ages. Now, this is the, I think this is the rate of, right. So, I'll have to study this again and then I'll explain to you when I'm reading the next chapter. Told you I've not read this book before, but let's continue. I think that the point has been made anyway. America's nationwide unemployment in November 2009 was around 10%, but the unemployment rate for African American males aged 16 to 19 without a high school diploma was 49%. For Caucasian females over age 45 with a college degree, it was 4%. Local stock markets in Germany and Japan. I don't know what's happening to my voice, you guys. Let me see how much longer. Not much longer. Okay, local stock markets in Germany and Japan were wiped out during World War II. Entire regions were bombed out. At the end of the war, German farms only produced enough food to provide the country's citizens with 1,000 calories a day. Compare that to the US, where the stock market more than doubled from 1941 through the end of 1945. And the economy was the strongest it had been in almost 2 decades. No one should expect members of these groups to go through the rest of their lives thinking the same thing about inflation or the stock markets or unemployment or money in general. No one should expect them to respond to financial information the same way. No one should assume they are influenced by the same incentives. No one should expect them to trust the same source of advice. No one should expect them to agree on what matters, what's worth it, what's likely to happen next, and what the best path forward is. Their view of money was formed in different worlds. And when that's the case, a view about money that one group of people thinks is outrageous can make perfect sense to another. A few years ago, the New York Times did a story on the working conditions of Foxconn, the massive Taiwanese electronics manufacturer. The conditions are often atrocious. Readers were rightly upset. But a fascinating response to the story came from the nephew of a Chinese worker who wrote in the comment section, "My aunt worked several years in what Americans call sweatshops. It was hard work, long hours, small wage, poor working conditions. Do you know what my aunt did before she worked in one of those factories? She was a prostitute." The idea of working in a sweatshop compared to that old lifestyle is an improvement. In my opinion, I know that my aunt would rather be exploited by an evil capitalist boss for a couple of dollars than have her body exploited by several men for pennies. That is why I am upset by many Americans thinking we do not have the same opportunities as the West. Our governmental infrastructure is different. The country is different. Yes, factory is hard labor. Could it be better? Yes, but only when you compare such to American jobs. I don't know what to make of these. Part of me wants to argue fiercely. Part of me wants to understand. But mostly, it's an example of how different experiences can lead to vastly different views within topics that one side intuitively thinks should be black and white. Every decision people make with money is justified by taking the information they have at the moment and plugging it into their unique mental model of how the world works. Those people can be misinformed. They can have incomplete information. They can be bad at math. They can be persuaded by rotten marketing. They can have no idea what they're doing. They can misjudge the consequences of their actions. Oh, can they ever? But every financial decision a person makes sense to them in that moment and checks the boxes they need to check. Okay. Where was I? Right. They tell themselves a story about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that story has been shaped by their own unique experiences. Take a simple example, lottery tickets. Americans spend more on them than movies, video games, music, sporting events, and books combined. Whoa. And who buys them? Mostly poor people. The lowest income households in the US on average spend $412 a year on lotto tickets, 4 times the amount of those in the highest income groups. 40% of Americans cannot come up with $400 in an emergency, which is to say those buying $400 in lottery tickets are by and large the same people who say they couldn't come up with $400 in an emergency. They are blowing their safety nets on something with 1 in millions chance of hitting it big. That seems crazy to me. It probably seems crazy to you too, but I'm not in the lowest income group. You're likely not either, so it's hard for many of us to intuitively grasp the subconscious reasoning of low-income lottery ticket buyers. But strain a little, and you can imagine it going something like this. We live paycheck to paycheck, and saving seems out of reach. Our prospects for much higher wages seem out of reach. We can't afford nice vacations, new cars, health insurance, or homes in safe neighborhoods. We can't put our kids through college without crippling debt. Much of the stuff you people who read finance books either have now or have a good chance of getting. We don't. Buying a lottery ticket is the only time in our lives we can hold a tangible dream of getting the good stuff that you already have and take for granted. We are paying for a dream, and you may not understand that because you're already living a dream. That's why we buy more tickets than you do. Make sense? You don't have to agree with this reasoning. Buying lotto tickets when you're broke is still a bad idea, but I can kind of understand why lotto ticket sales persist. And that idea, what you're doing seems crazy, but I kind of understand why you're doing it, and covers the root of many of our financial decisions. Few people make financial decisions purely with a spreadsheet. They make them at the dinner table or in a company meeting. Places where personal history, your own unique view of the world, ego, pride, marketing, and odd incentives are scrambled together into a narrative that works for you. Another important point that helps explain why money decisions are so difficult and why there is so much misbehavior is to recognize how new the topic is. Money has been around a long time. King Aleates of Lydia, now part of Turkey, is thought to have created the first official currency in 600 BC. But the modern foundation of money decisions, saving and investing is based around concepts that are practically infants. Take retirement. At the end of 2018, there was $27 trillion in US retirement accounts, making it the main driver of the common investors' saving and investing decisions. But the entire concept of being entitled to retirement is at most 2 generations old. Before World War II, most Americans worked until they died. That was the expectation and the reality. The labor force participation rate of men aged 65 and over was above 50% until the 1940s. Okay, so this is the graph of labor force participation for men age 65 plus. You can see the numbers reducing. See, each year the numbers of people who are working after the age of 65 is incredibly, it's just reducing and reducing. Social Security aimed to change this, but its initial benefits were nothing close to a proper pension. When Ida Mae Fuller cashed the first Social Security check in 1940, it was for $22 or $416 adjusted for inflation. Well, that is incredibly low. It's not enough to retire. It was not until the 1980s that the average social security check for retirees exceeded $1,000 a month, adjusted for inflation. More than a quarter of the Americans aged 65 were classified by the Census Bureau as living in poverty until the late 1960s. There's a widespread belief along the lines of everyone used to have a private pension, but this is wildly exaggerated. The Employee Benefit Research Institute explains only a quarter of those aged 65 or older had pension income in 1975. Among that lucky minority, only 15% of household income came from a pension. The New York Times wrote in 1955 about the growing desire but continued inability to retire. To rephrase an old saying, everyone talks about retirement, but apparently very few people do anything about it. It was not until the 1980s that the idea that everyone deserves and should have a dignified retirement took hold. And the way to get that dignified retirement ever since has been an expectation that everybody will save and invest their own money. Let me reiterate how new this idea is. The 401k, the backbone savings vehicle of American retirement, did not exist until 1978. The Roth IRA was not born until 1998. If there was a person, if it were a person, it would be barely old enough to drink. Ooh, okay. It should surprise no one that many of us are bad at saving and investing for retirement. We're not crazy. We're just all newbies, mate. Okay? Same goes for college. The share of Americans over age 25 with a bachelor's degree has gone from far less than 1 in 20 in 1940 to 1 in 4 by 2015. The average college tuition over that time rose more than fourfold, adjusted for inflation. Something so big and so important hitting society so fast explains why, for example, so many people have made poor decisions with student loans over the last 20 years. There is not decades of accumulated experience to even attempt to learn from. We are winging it. Well, the other is giving us a lot of grace, don't you think? Same for index funds, which are less than 50 years old, and hedge funds, which didn't take off until the last 25 years. Even widespread use of consumer debt, mortgages, credit cards, car loans did not take off until after World War II, when the GI Bill made it easier for millions of Americans to borrow. Dogs were domesticated 10,000 years ago and still retain some behaviors of their wild ancestors. Yet here we are, with between 20 and 50 years of experience in the modern financial system, hoping to be perfectly acclimated. For a topic that is so influenced by emotion versus fact, this is a problem, and it helps explain why we don't always do what we're supposed to do with money. We all do crazy stuff with money because we are all relatively new to this game. And what looks crazy to you might make sense to me, but no one is crazy. We all make decisions based on our own unique experiences that seem to make sense to us in a given moment. Now, let me tell you a story about how Bill Gates got rich. Then we go to chapter 2. That is a read for next time. I think, I don't know, I feel my throat being a little scratchy. I'm not sure I'm going to read tomorrow, but I will definitely continue reading chapter 2 the day after tomorrow. Or maybe tomorrow. We'll see with where my voice will be, because it's July. It's really cold. I have a cold. Yeah. Okay, so that is what that's it. That is The Psychology of Money, chapter 1. I can't wait to get my mindset changed. I can't wait to see what the rest of the book has. Really, really, because I mean, right now I'm at an age where I need to start thinking seriously about things concerning finances and things like that. And well, I realized that I barely know anything about how money works, about how to make money, how to keep it, how to multiply it. So that's why I decided to read this, because I've had a lot of people recommending it. So I'm going to try and say, okay, so that's it, you guys. Have a lovely night, evening. Bye, the person who's in the live. Good night. Okay. Well, yo, I'm trying to live the life. Nataka kutoka but sijui mtu anatoka wapi jamani. Jamani. If you want to mtu anatoka aje? Okay. What?